The city pulsed with life. A symphony of car horns and distant sirens played out beneath a sky bruised with the day's end. People scurried like ants below, each with their own destination, their own story. But above it all, reaching for the fading light, stood the city's giants. Towers of glass and steel, testaments to ambition and progress. Among them, almost lost in the ever-growing forest of new construction, stood an elder statesman. Its once bright facade was now dulled with age, streaked with the grime of countless storms. This building had seen it all, booms and busts, celebrations and tragedies. It had stood as a silent witness to the city's relentless evolution. Inside, the building hummed with a different kind of energy. The day was winding down. The once crowded floors were now sparsely populated. A lone secretary typed furiously, trying to beat the clock. A security guard, bored and restless, made his rounds, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. The air hung heavy, almost expectant. The silence wasn't truly silent, not really. It was punctuated by the low groan of the old building, the creak of its aging bones. A faint electrical hum, almost too low to hear, seemed to vibrate through the very structure itself. It was the heartbeat of the city, yes, but also something else, something ancient, something unsettling.
Leaned heavily on his broom, his gaze sweeping the lobby. He knew every inch of this building, every groan and sigh. He'd started working here as a young man, fresh-faced and full of dreams. Now, his face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each line telling a story.
The old skyscraper wasn't just a job to John. It was a part of him. He'd seen it in its prime, a symbol of the city's aspirations. He'd witnessed its slow decline, felt it in his bones as the years went by. The flickering fluorescent lights, the occasional groan of settling concrete, they were all familiar whispers to him. Tonight, however, the whispers felt different, more urgent. There was a tremor in the air, a subtle vibration that set his teeth on edge. It wasn't just the usual settling of an old building. John knew the difference.
He'd felt it in his gut earlier, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He'd tried to warn them, of course. Tried to tell the young ones, the ones who thought they knew everything, that this building held secrets, that it was tired, weary from carrying the weight of so many years. But they just laughed him off, dismissed him as a rambling old man. "Just an earthquake drill, John," they'd said, patting his arm with a condescending smile.
John knew better. He could feel it in his bones. A storm was coming.
Tapped away at her keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. The deadline loomed, and her boss's voice, sharp and demanding, echoed in her ears. She barely registered the tremors that ran through the building, dismissing them as a passing subway train.
She glanced at the clock, her heart sinking. 5 more minutes, just 5 more minutes, and she could escape this fluorescent-lit prison. She could almost taste the freedom, the promise of a glass of wine and mindless television. It was the small joys that kept her going.
Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the office into an eerie twilight. Sarah swore under her breath, her train of thought shattered. "Great," she muttered, "just what I needed."
She could hear the distant hum of the backup generator kicking in, a reassuring sound in the sudden darkness. But then a sound cut through the air, low and guttural, like the groan of a dying beast. It seemed to emanate from the very core of the building, vibrating through her bones. Sarah felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. That was new. That wasn't the familiar symphony of the city. Something was wrong. The tremor returned, stronger this time. A low rumble that seemed to shake the building to its core. Pictures on the walls rattled, and a fine dust sifted down from the ceiling like snow. Sarah felt a surge of primal fear, an instinctive understanding that something was very wrong.
She wasn't alone in her fear. Across the office, her coworkers exchanged uneasy glances, their forced smiles fading into expressions of concern. The low hum of conversation died down, replaced by an unsettling silence broken only by the creaking of the old building.
Down in the lobby, the security guard, a burly man named Frank, felt it too. He gripped his baton a little tighter, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. He'd seen his fair share of trouble in his time, but this felt different. This felt like the calm before a storm.
John, hunched over his broom in the corner, felt a cold dread grip his heart. He knew this building, knew its rhythms and its secrets. And this tremor, this deep, shuddering groan, it spoke of a danger far greater than a passing subway train.
As quickly as it had begun, the tremor subsided, leaving an eerie silence in its wake.
Whew, I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. My heart was pounding against my ribs.
She tried to laugh it off, to tell herself it was nothing, but the fear lingered, a knot of unease in the pit of her stomach.
Just a few more minutes. Then I can escape this place, escape this feeling of dread.
She gathered her things, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Suddenly, a sharp crack, like a gunshot, echoed through the office.
God.
Her eyes widened in horror as a spiderweb of cracks appeared on the wall opposite her desk. The cracks spread with alarming speed, snaking across the plaster like veins of lightning. A collective gasp went through the office as everyone turned to stare at the wall, their faces pale with fear. The illusion of safety, the belief that they were secure within the heart of the city, shattered like the plaster, now crumbling around them. John watched the scene unfold from the lobby, a grim sense of satisfaction mixed with his fear.
They didn't believe me, wouldn't listen to my warnings. Now they're starting to understand.
The old man straightened slowly, his hand gripping the handle of his broom as if it were a lifeline.
I told you, this building, it ain't safe no more.
He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was just the beginning. He watched as Frank, the security guard, barked into his radio, his face pale and drawn. He saw the fear in the eyes of the young receptionist as she fumbled with the phone, her hands trembling. They were all starting to panic, and who could blame them? John took a deep breath, the weight of years settling on his shoulders. He might be old, but he wasn't helpless.
I know this building like the back of my hand. There's got to be a way out, a way to escape this disaster.
He just had to find it, and fast. A low, guttural groan, like the dying breath of a giant, echoed through the building. It wasn't a sound, not really, but a feeling. A sickening lurch that sent shivers down Sarah's spine.
Oh no. The floor?
The floor beneath her feet seemed to tilt, ever so slightly, and then the screaming started. Her chair rolled away from her desk, its wheels spinning uselessly in the air. The crack in the wall, once a hairline fracture, exploded outwards, showering the office in plaster dust and debris. Sarah threw her arms up over her head, a futile attempt to shield herself from the falling debris. Around her, chaos reigned. Desks and chairs slid across the floor, colliding with each other in a deafening cacophony. People screamed, their voices high-pitched and panicked as they scrambled for cover, for any semblance of safety. John, down in the lobby, felt the building shift beneath him. He grabbed onto a nearby pillar, his knuckles white as he braced himself against the sudden movement. The air filled with the roar of collapsing concrete and the shattering of glass, a symphony of destruction that sent a primal fear coursing through his veins. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the office into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight.
The air, it's thick with dust and the smell of burnt wiring.
Sarah, still huddled on the floor, could hear the panicked gasps and cries of her co-workers, but she couldn't see them, couldn't see anything. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling, and managed to activate the flashlight. The small beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. Desks were overturned, papers rained down from the ceiling like confetti, and everywhere she looked, people stumbled about, blinded and disoriented.
Ah!
The floor lurched again, this time more violently, and Sarah cried out as she lost her footing. She landed hard on her side, pain shooting through her shoulder. She could feel the building tilting, slowly but inexorably, like a ship sinking beneath the waves.
Frank!
Down in the lobby, John clung to the pillar, his body battered by falling debris. He could hear Frank yelling something, his voice hoarse and desperate, but the words were lost in the roar of the collapsing building. The air was thick with dust, making it almost impossible to breathe. Through the haze of dust and panic, Sarah saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was John, his face grimed with dirt, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of fear and determination. He was waving his arms, beckoning her towards him, his voice a raspy whisper above the din.
This way. There's a service stairwell. It might still be standing.
Sarah hesitated for a moment, her mind struggling to process the situation. The building was collapsing around her, and her instincts screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But there was something in John's eyes, a desperate hope that mirrored her own, that gave her a sliver of courage. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain that shot through her ankle, and stumbled towards him. John grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled her through the debris-strewn office. They dodged falling ceiling tiles and overturned furniture, their bodies battered by the relentless rain of dust and debris. Every breath was a struggle, every step a victory against the chaos that surrounded them. John, his hand gripping Sarah's tightly, pulled her through the wreckage of the office. They stumbled through a maze of overturned desks and fallen ceiling tiles, their way lit by the flickering beam of Sarah's phone. The air was thick with dust, making it difficult to breathe, and the stench of burning wires stung their nostrils.
This way!
John shouted, his voice hoarse. He pulled Sarah towards a door, partially hidden by debris. It was a service stairwell, narrow and dark, but it offered a glimmer of hope in the rapidly deteriorating building. They stumbled into the stairwell, their lungs burning with each desperate gasp for air. The concrete steps were littered with debris, chunks of plaster raining down from the ceiling above. The stairwell echoed with the terrifying groans and creaks of the dying building, each sound a hammer blow to their already frayed nerves. Sarah, struggling to keep up with John's relentless pace, could feel her fear threatening to overwhelm her. She wanted to scream, to give in to the panic that clawed at the edges of her mind, but something kept her moving. Perhaps it was John's unwavering determination, or maybe it was the primal instinct to survive, but she pushed on, her legs burning with exhaustion. They descended the stairs, each step a victory against the chaos that raged around them. The air grew thicker, hotter, and the darkness seemed to press in on them, amplifying their fear. Sarah stumbled again, her ankle twisting beneath her. She cried out, the sound swallowed by the deafening groan of the building.
We're almost there, just a few more flights.
John caught her before she could fall, his grip firm despite the tremor in his hands. But as they rounded the landing, their hearts sank. The stairwell was blocked. A massive concrete slab, dislodged from the floor above, lay wedged between the walls, effectively sealing their escape route. They were trapped. Sarah leaned against the cold concrete wall, her chest heaving, her mind reeling. She could feel the building swaying around them, a slow, sickening motion that spoke of imminent collapse. Panic welled up inside her, threatening to consume her.
Help! Can anyone hear me?
John, his face a mask of despair, pounded on the concrete slab with his fists. His voice was raw with desperation, but his cries were met with only an eerie silence, broken only by the ominous creaking of the building. Sarah, her back against the cold concrete, slid slowly to the ground, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the terrifying reality of their situation. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of something burning, acrid and sharp, filled her nostrils.
A window. They must have blown out a window on one of the upper floors.
Suddenly, a sound cut through the oppressive silence, a sharp, shattering explosion from above. John looked up, his eyes widening.
Come on, we have to reach that window.
He pointed to a faint light, flickering like a distant star high above them. It was a sliver of hope in the overwhelming darkness, a sign that they might not be alone, that rescue might be possible. John helped Sarah to her feet, his grip firm and reassuring. They climbed over the concrete slab, their movements awkward but determined. The way up was treacherous, the stairwell littered with debris, but they pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and the faint flicker of hope above. They reached the landing where the window had blown out. The air was filled with dust and the roar of the wind whipping through the gaping maw of the broken window. Looking out, they saw a scene of utter devastation. The building across the street, once a gleaming tower of glass and steel, was now a mangled wreck, its facade ripped away to reveal its shattered innards. And then they saw them. Figures on the roof of the building next door, silhouetted against the dying light. They were shouting, waving their arms, urging them to jump.
We have to jump,
John said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a desperate hope.
Let's do it.
Sarah stared at the chasm that separated them from the neighboring building. It looked impossibly wide, a yawning abyss that promised only oblivion. Her mind screamed at her, telling her it was suicide, that she would never make it. But as she felt the building sway beneath her feet, felt the tremor that ran through its dying core, she knew she had no choice. It was jump or be crushed beneath the weight of the collapsing building. It was a choice between a slim chance of survival and certain death. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding against her ribs.
On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
John nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. They launched themselves into the void, their bodies small and insignificant against the backdrop of the dying city. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, the wind whipping at her face, tearing at her clothes. For a moment there was nothing but the feeling of weightlessness, the terrifying sensation of falling. Then a jarring impact as her hands grasped the edge of the neighboring building. Her fingers scraped against concrete, pain shooting up her arms. She dangled precariously, her body swaying in the wind, her grip the only thing between her and the abyss. Above her, John grunted with effort, pulling himself up with surprising strength. He reached down, his hand closing around her wrist like a vice.
Don't let go,
He yelled, his voice strained. Together they scrambled onto the roof, collapsing onto the rough concrete, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling with exertion and terror. Sarah lay there for a moment, her eyes closed, the feel of solid ground beneath her a precious and fragile thing. They were alive for now. The roof was a scene of chaos. People coughed and stumbled through the dust and debris, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights of emergency vehicles in the distance. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the acrid tang of fear. John, ever vigilant, pulled Sarah to her feet.
We're not safe yet. We need to get higher.
He pointed to a narrow metal ladder bolted to the side of the building, leading to the roof access hatch. They joined the desperate scramble upwards, their bodies jostled and pushed by the panicked crowd. Sarah, her ankle throbbing with every step, clung to John's arm, her knuckles white as she fought to maintain her balance on the swaying ladder. Above them, the access hatch was open, a beacon of hope in the chaos. But the opening was small, and the crowd, fueled by terror, surged forward, a desperate mob clawing for survival. John, his face grim, put himself between Sarah and the crush of bodies.
"Let her through,"
he shouted, his voice lost in the cacophony of screams and sobs. He pushed back against the tide of humanity, his strength failing as panic threatened to engulf them. Sarah felt herself being pulled under, the air thick and suffocating. She cried out, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the dying city around them. Her vision blurred, her lungs burning as she struggled to draw breath, and then a hand reached down, strong and sure, pulling her up through the press of bodies. She stumbled onto the roof access platform, gasping for air, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She turned back to look for John, her heart pounding, but the opening was gone, swallowed by the crush of bodies.
"John!"
She screamed, her voice a raw and ragged sound in the night, but there was no answer. Only the deafening roar of the collapsing building, the ground vibrating beneath her feet as the city she knew breathed its last, taking John with it. The rooftop, once a sanctuary, now felt like a life raft adrift on a raging sea. The ground vibrated with the death throes of the city, the air thick with dust and the acrid smell of smoke.
"John, where are you?"
Sarah, her body battered and bruised, her heart shattered, clung to the edge of the roof access hatch, her eyes searching frantically for any sign of John. But it was no use. The crowd, a mass of panicked humanity, surged around her, their fear palpable, their cries for help lost in the roar of the dying city.
"Please, John, I can't lose you."
The building across the street, its facade ripped away, seemed to leer down at her, its skeletal remains a grim testament to the power of the forces unleashed. The tremors intensified, the very air crackling with a strange energy. She could feel it in her bones, a deep, primal fear that resonated with the groaning metal and shattering glass.
"This can't be happening.
The city, her city, was dying, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. A wave of nausea swept over her, the world tilting beneath her feet. She closed her eyes for a moment, surrendering to the chaos, to the overwhelming grief that threatened to consume her.
John was gone, swallowed by the mob, by the collapsing building, and she was alone. Utterly alone. And then she felt it. A sickening lurch, a sensation of weightlessness that stole her breath. The ground seemed to fall away beneath her, the screams of the crowd fading into a distant roar as she plunged into the abyss. She opened her eyes just for a moment and saw the sky, a swirling vortex of smoke and debris, framed by the jagged edges of the collapsing building. The wind whipped at her face, tore at her clothes, as she tumbled through the air, her body a fragile projectile caught in the grip of forces beyond her control. Time seemed to distort, stretching and contracting in a dizzying dance. One moment she was on the rooftop, the next she was surrounded by darkness, the air thick with dust and the smell of death. She closed her eyes again, her mind rebelling against the impossible reality of her situation. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a fiery explosion, not in a dramatic last stand, but in a freefall into oblivion. She thought of John, of his kind eyes and his gentle smile, and a sob escaped her lips, lost in the roar of the dying city. Then, as suddenly as it began, the fall was over. She landed hard, her body slamming against a pile of rubble, the air driven from her lungs in a rush. Pain shot through her, a searing agony that blotted out all other thoughts. She lay there for a moment, her eyes closed, her body trembling, unsure if she was alive or dead. Gradually, the world around her began to filter back into her consciousness. The dust, thick and choking, filled her nostrils, her throat. The air was filled with a strange silence, broken only by the faint crackle of flames and the groan of settling debris. She opened her eyes, her vision blurry at first, then slowly clearing. She was surrounded by rubble, a mountain of twisted metal and shattered concrete that stretched as far as she could see. The city, her city, was gone, reduced to a wasteland of dust and silence. And then she heard it. A faint moan, a sound of pain and fear, coming from somewhere beneath the rubble. She struggled to sit up, her body screaming in protest, her eyes scanning the debris field. Someone was alive, a flicker of hope, fragile but tenacious, ignited within her. She was alive, and somewhere beneath the ruins of her world, there was another soul struggling to survive. And in that moment, amidst the dust and the silence, she knew what she had to do. She had to find them. Sarah slowly pushed herself up from the rubble, each movement sending a jolt of pain through her battered body. The dust swirled around her, a ghostly shroud obscuring the devastation. Coughing, she brushed the grit from her eyes, trying to make sense of the world that had been remade in an instant. Where once towering structures had scraped the sky, now only jagged mounds of debris reached up towards the smoke-filled sky. The air, heavy with the smell of dust and fire, was eerily silent, the usual symphony of city sounds replaced by a haunting quiet. The only sounds were the crackle of distant flames and the whisper of the wind through the wreckage. Her gaze fell upon the remains of the skyscraper, now a mangled carcass of steel and glass. A cold wave of grief washed over her as she remembered John's kind face, his steady presence in the chaos. He had saved her life, sacrificed himself so that she might live. And she would live. She would honor his memory by surviving, by finding a reason to hope amidst the ruins. Even as the enormity of the disaster threatened to overwhelm her, a spark of determination flickered within her. She was alone. Yes, but she was alive. And somewhere beneath the wreckage, she could hear a faint cry for help, a reminder that she was not the only one who had survived the city's fall. Sarah took a deep breath, the dust catching in her throat, and forced herself to move. Her body ached, her head spun, but she pushed on, driven by the faint cries that seemed to come from somewhere beneath a twisted pile of metal and concrete. Finding a piece of metal jutting out from the rubble, she used it as leverage, her muscles screaming in protest as she strained to move a large chunk of concrete. The dust swirled around her, choking her, blinding her, but she refused to give up. Each small victory, each piece of debris cleared away, fueled her resolve. She wasn't sure who she was searching for, didn't know if it was friend or stranger buried beneath the wreckage, but it didn't matter. Someone needed her help, and that was reason enough to fight. As she dug, she thought of John, of his quiet strength and unwavering hope. He wouldn't give up. He would want her to keep fighting, to cling to life, even as the world crumbled around her. And so she dug, her hands raw, her body exhausted, but her spirit unbroken. The cries grew louder now, a beacon guiding her through the dust and despair. She was close. She could feel it. And she knew, with a certainty that transcended the horror of the collapse, that she would not be alone. They would face the dawn together, survivors of a city lost, but with a will to rebuild, to honor the memory of those who had been lost, and to find hope amidst the ruins.